When my son was about 18 months old, we had this routine every day. On the way to his daycare, we'd pass by a cemetery, always the same one, and without fail, every time we got close, he'd wave at the same grave saying, "Bye-bye," or "Hello," while grinning and waving as if he saw someone. And there was never anyone else around. It wasn't like he was just mimicking me or anything, because I wasn't waving or even acknowledging the cemetery. It really seemed like he saw something there, something that I couldn't see. It gave me a strange feeling every time. I mean, what could he have been possibly waving at? It made me wonder if young children really do see things that we don't. They have such innocent and open minds. Maybe they pick up on things adults can't anymore. My son wasn't talking much yet, but the way he interacted with that grave made it seem like he knew someone was there. In fact, I wasn't the only one who noticed weird things like this. A lot of other parents have shared similar experiences online. One woman said that her daughter would wave and say goodbye whenever they passed the same spot on their walks, which later turned out to be the location of a hidden cemetery. Another parent said their kid would sometimes point at an empty corner of the room, waving and greeting an old man, even though no one else was around. There are so many stories like that out there, kids waving at empty spaces or laughing at ceilings as if someone's playing with them. It really makes you think, are they just imagining it? Or do they know something that we don't? Some parents feel comforted, like their kids are connecting with something gentle. Others get freaked out and try to ignore it. Then, of course, some parents believe that their children might be interacting with something with ill intentions, a malevolent spirit. Personally, I never knew how to feel about it. I tried to brush it off, but it always stuck with me. My son eventually outgrew the habit of waving at that grave, and he doesn't remember anything about it now. But even after all this time, I still wonder, was there someone or something really there all along? I think it's kind of comforting to think that maybe our loved ones stay with us in ways we can't fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, our kids are able to see them. This story comes from a part-time job that I used to have in a high-rise office building. You know the type, tall, glass-walled, packed with a dozen floors and offices. The kind of place that looks beautiful in a cityscape but feels a little cold and impersonal inside. The building had express elevators that only stopped at certain floors, every 8 to be exact. So if you were going to floors 1 to 16, you'd start on floor 1, ride up the express to 8, and then stop at each floor from there. It was a strange but an efficient system. After 8 o'clock at night, things got a bit inconvenient though. That's when the companies on the floors 1 through 7 closed down. And for security, the elevators from the ground floor would only take you up to floor 8. Once there, you would have to show your ID badge to the security guard to catch a different elevator. For those of us on the lower floors, like my office on 12, it was a bit of a pain, but it had become routine. One particular evening, we had stayed late to finish a project. Another part-timer and I had been sent to pick up some printed materials that had been delayed, and by the time we got back to the building, it was just past 8 p.m. We sprinted through the lobby and barely made it to the last express elevator before the doors slid shut. We were both out of breath, laughing about our close call as we leaned against the walls, letting the adrenaline wear off. My coworker pressed the button for floor 12 and then turned back to ask if anybody else needed a floor. That's when we realized that we weren't alone. There, in the back corner of the elevator, stood an older man. He was slim, with neat, dark-framed glasses, and a short-sleeved shirt, odd for the middle of winter. His face was gentle, almost serene, with a warmth that's rare to see in a stranger, especially in a building full of office workers. Something about him made you instantly feel at ease. "Would you mind pressing floor 9 for me?" he said with a polite nod. His voice was soft and kind. Although we were total strangers, he had this kind of grandfatherly way about him that made me feel as if we'd met before. My coworker pressed the button and the man gave us a smile. "It's a lot of work staying late, you know," he said, his voice tinged with quiet concern. "Make sure you're taking care of yourself." He had the look of someone who genuinely meant it. When the elevator chimed, signaling a stop, my coworker and I automatically stepped aside, making room for the man to exit. But just as the doors opened, we heard a voice from outside the elevator. "What are you two doing? Blocking the door. It's going to close on you." It was our manager, leaning casually against the wall, cigarette in hand. He was looking at us, as if we'd gone mad. The floor indicator on the wall showed a familiar symbol, the logo for the 12th floor. Well, we exchanged a look, both of us in total disbelief. I turned back to glance at the man we had made room for, but no one was there. The elevator was completely empty. My coworker had looked just as confused as I did. And we both fumbled out of the elevator, glancing back one more time as the doors shut, wondering, where the hell has he gone? Our manager saw our bewildered expressions and chuckled. "Huh, you must have run into Saeki-san." The name meant nothing to us, but our manager just shrugged, like it was no big deal. He explained that years ago, back when he was new to the company, there had been this kind man named Saeki, who worked for a securities firm on the 9th floor. Saeki-san had been nearing retirement and was well known throughout the building, even by people who didn't work directly with him. He was famous for looking out for others, always making sure that anyone who seemed overworked or stressed got a kind word from him. One night, after a particularly grueling day at work, he returned from a late meeting, looking especially worn out. Sometime during the night, he collapsed in the elevator lobby on the 9th floor. The cleaning staff found him early the next morning, slumped over near the express elevator. The entire building was devastated, and hundreds of people from different offices attended his funeral. The security staff in particular was deeply affected. They regretted not having seen him sooner, not being able to help him when he needed it most. As a result, they implemented a new elevator curfew, cutting access after 8 p.m. to make sure no one would be left alone and unaccounted for during the late hours. People say he still shows up every now and then, usually to people who are pushing themselves too hard, my manager said, his voice softening. It's like his way of reminding us to take it easy, not to overdo it. With a rare and almost fatherly smile, he added, "Well, you know what? If you ran into Saeki-san, maybe it's a sign you should head home tonight. Get some rest. Oh, and actually, you two go ahead and take tomorrow off too." I glanced over at my coworker, who still looked a little shaken. Later, he admitted that he'd been feeling feverish that day, but had been planning to come in the next day. It was only after he took that unexpected day off that his fever broke. If our manager hadn't insisted, he would have likely forced himself to work through it. Even now, I remember Saeki-san's gentle smile, the warmth in his voice, and the kind look in his eyes. It didn't seem like a ghost. He'd felt as real as any of us, and for a moment we'd been strangers, sharing a quiet moment in the late night calm of an empty elevator. Even now, I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe in the kindness that lingers, even beyond one's time. Maybe that's what we felt that night. The gentle presence of someone who never really left, watching over those who needed it the most. And perhaps every once in a while there's a kind soul like Saeki-san, who keeps looking out for the weary, the overworked, reminding them with a gentle smile to take care of themselves. It's comforting to think that even after he was gone, Saeki-san continued his quiet watch over the building, making sure that none of us pushed ourselves as far as he did. After all, in Japan, overworking to the point of death is a recognized phenomenon. Karoshi, workers can be so consumed by responsibility that they ignore their physical limits until it's too late. People like Saeki-san serve as gentle reminders to the overburdened, urging us to slow down and value our health over endless hours of work. Perhaps he was one of those souls who had pushed himself beyond his limits, only to become a lasting guardian in the end, quietly protecting those who risked following his same path. This is a story about a strange and terrifying encounter that happened to us when we were in the 5th grade. It started as an ordinary afternoon. My friend and I were hanging out, sitting side by side in my room, deep into a gaming session. We were laughing, shouting at the screen, and completely absorbed in the game. Then out of nowhere, the keyboard stopped working. The keys felt stiff, unresponsive, as though something had jammed the entire system. At first, we didn't think much of it. Computers glitch all the time, right? We figured that it was just some technical hiccup, and went about trying to fix it. We had no idea that this was only the beginning. Just as we started rebooting the computer, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. Ding dong. I glanced at my friend, and he shrugged. I got up thinking it might be a delivery, or a friend dropping by. I opened the door expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. The street outside was quiet. There was no footsteps, no voices, just empty air. For a moment, I thought it might have been a prank. Some kid playing Ding Dong Ditch or Knock Down Ginger. I laughed a little sarcastic laugh, and then I shut the door and went back inside. Not even a minute later, the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence, making us both jump. I walked over to pick it up, noticing that the caller ID said, "Private number." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the receiver, as an uneasy feeling crept over me. Who would be calling us from a blocked number? No one who called our house ever did that. "Just answer it," my friend said, trying to sound brave. So I did. "Hello?" I said. There was no reply. All I could hear was the steady, rhythmic sound of static. "Hello?" I repeated. Still nothing, just that same unsettling buzz in the background. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the call cut off with a loud click. By now, the playful atmosphere of the afternoon was completely gone. My friend and I looked at one another, our faces pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Neither of us had ever believed in ghosts or the supernatural. We were the kind of kids who rolled our eyes at people who claimed to see spirits or hear voices. Maybe that's why we started to rationalize it. "It's probably just someone messing with us," I said, trying to sound convincing. "Someone's just trying to scare us." "Yeah," my friend agreed. "Let's catch him in the act." We decided to fight back. I grabbed an old baseball bat from my closet, while my friend took position near the window, ready to spot anybody approaching the house. The doorbell rang again. This time, though, we were ready. I darted towards the front door, yanked it open as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging, as I prepared to confront whoever was out there. But there was no one there, not a single soul. The only thing we found was a single drop of red. Blood. It was stark against the grey concrete of the porch. It was almost glistening under the weak afternoon light. I froze. My friend leaned over my shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. "Let's go back inside," he whispered. We bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind us. We didn't even bother trying to explain what we saw. We just scrambled under the kotatsu, trembling like little kids who had seen a monster. We stayed there for hours, clutching the bat and peering nervously around the room. The computer screen was still frozen. The phone was silent. The house was unnervingly still. And then, the doorbell rang again. Oh, we didn't move this time. We didn't even breathe. It's been years since that day, and I still don't know who or what was at the door. That drop of blood was the last sign we ever saw of it. Nothing else happened that night, but I didn't sleep a wink. I guess the same could be said about my friend too. Even now, every time I hear a doorbell, my chest tightens a little. I know it's silly, and sometimes when I pass by that old house that I grew up in, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone to answer the door. This happened 7 years ago, after I graduated from high school and began my steps towards preparing for college life. Everyone my age was getting their driving licenses, and one of my friends got his. He was also given his dad's old car, so we often went out on drives together. It was the height of summer, and ghost stories and scary movies were all over TV and in the local cinemas. Inspired by what we were watching, at the time, we decided to head on out for a little ghost hunting of our own. Hi, Jay here. There is a reason why ghost stories and horror films are popular during summer. You see, in Japan the summers are unbearably hot at times, and what better way to cool down than giving yourself the chills while watching or listening to something scary? I can say that based on experience, it works. Pop-up haunted houses are also popular. You know, the ones where actors jump out at you? Yeah, those are very good at cooling you down. If you take a look at the screen now, you can see a poster for a haunted house attraction, an obakiyashiki, that I went to. If I remember correctly, it was about a girl in the photo here. She was trapped in a suitcase after playing hide and seek, and no one found her. So you enter into her haunted house, and scares are lurking around every corner. I went to another haunted house attraction that measured your heart rate. They take it very seriously, and they're really good fun. Sorry for the ramble. Anyway, back to the story. We set our sights on an abandoned hospital in our area. The hospital was located deep in the mountains, in a really quiet spot. Usually with abandoned hospitals, they end up staying dormant for a period of time, and then they inevitably get demolished. Not this one though. It stood beyond a locked gate, and that gate had long rusted, and the "Do Not Trespass" sign's lettering had long faded. It was well known in our area as a haunted location. Some of the kids who were a few years older than us, back when we were at school, had been in there a bunch of times. They had even created a little hole in the fence, which served as a way in and a way out. My friend and I pulled up. It was a dark night, perfect for sneaking in and sneaking out. We approached as quietly as possible, keeping our flashlights aimed at the ground. We crunched through the overgrown grass and dried dirt through a hole in the fence. We crept in through a kicked door at the side, and then finally, we were in the hospital. It was dead quiet in there. There was still those curtain partitions that separated the spaces on the ward hanging up. Legend has it that the hospital used to be a psychiatric hospital. The windows were covered with a metal cage, which was quite freaky to see at night. I imagined those patients on the ward, and thought about how it must have been for them. The whole hospital was in disarray. Since it was locally famous, it seemed like lots of people had gotten in and ransacked the place. There were, however, some machines left in there, for reasons unknown to us, there were countless papers scattered all across the floors of the wards. I guessed that they could have been medical records. We never bothered to pick one up and check though. We saw stretchers in the hallway, and a rusted, dented-looking wheelchair toppled over on its side. Honestly, being in there reminded me of the horror games I used to play on the PS1 at the time. One thing we both noticed was the fact that someone had spray painted on one of the dirty walls, "Nurses stationed this way," in red paint. The atmosphere was getting to us because my friend and I weren't as talkative as we were before we went in. I think that might have been down to the fact that both of us were looking forward to leaving, but we were just not able to admit that to each other. I remember walking over the broken glass and debris, and I felt like I had had enough. My senses were heightened, and I felt like anything could be lurking around at any corner. It was quite stressful. I spoke to my friend and I said that I only wanted to take a quick peek on the second floor, and then I wanted to go. He felt the same as me, and I was glad. The atmosphere in there was so heavy. I just didn't want to be there. I wanted to get out. I felt like something was about to happen. I don't know why I felt like that. There was just something in the air. There was only one route to the second floor. We had to climb up a narrow staircase. We slowly made our way up to the top, and at the top we were greeted by a glass door. I went to push it open, wanting to be done with our urban exploration for the night, but I found that it didn't budge. It was stuck. There was a broken window next to the door, but we decided it would be too dangerous for us to attempt crawling through there. So we said we'd call it a day there. We turned to go back downstairs. However, just at the moment we began our descent, we heard something that caused us to stop. We were of course wary of police, homeless people and other explorers, but the noise we heard sounded nothing like any of that. I definitely heard something coming from the other side of the glass door, and it sounded to me, and my friend can verify this, like a nurse call bell. You know, like some kind of electronic jingle to alert the nurses. I'm so glad that my friend reacted to the sound as well, because that told me that he had heard it too and I wasn't going mad. The noise set my friend running, and before I had a chance to start after him, I looked through the glass, and I swear I saw some kind of shadowy looking figure stood in the middle of the walkway of the halls. After seeing what I saw, I quickly ran after my friend, and I think I can safely say that the pair of us will never set foot in that place again. It was truly chilling. I heard this one from a guy I used to work with. He's given me permission to share the story. So here we go. A male university student was moving to the city and was looking for a cheap apartment. As a student, money was tight, so the priority was finding something affordable. When he went to a real estate agent and asked for options within his limited budget, the agent almost instantly recommended an apartment that was shockingly cheap. It seemed too good to be true. The location was excellent, the room was spacious, and the rent ridiculously low for that area. Suspiciously low. The student, he couldn't help but wonder if something was wrong with it. Maybe there was some structural problems, or it had some hidden defect that wasn't obvious at first glance. Still, on one drab evening in autumn, he decided to go check it out, expecting to find cracks in the walls, water damage, crazy neighbors, or some other glaring issue. But after a thorough look around, everything seemed fine. Nothing felt off, at least not yet. Then it came to him, what if it's one of those apartments? You know the type, places with a tragic past where something awful happened, the kind of place that people believe is cursed or haunted. It's not uncommon to find stigmatized properties or homes with a history, renting at lower prices. The thought lingered for a moment, but the apartment was perfect otherwise. He really needed that place, so he ignored the nagging feeling he had about it and signed the lease. That night, he finished moving in. The apartment was a little drafty, and it was the middle of autumn, so the breeze wasn't exactly welcome. After a long day of moving, he was ready to crash out. Exhausted, he crawled into bed, turned off the lights, and tried to settle into the unfamiliar space. It was quiet, eerily quiet, actually, but he just chalked it up to the neighborhood being calmer than he expected. Just as he was starting to drift off, he heard knock, knock. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from the front door. His first thought was maybe it was someone in the building coming to say hello. Or maybe it was the landlord checking in. After all, it was his first night there. He dragged himself out of bed, shuffled to the door, and checked through the peephole. No one was there. He opened the door anyway, looking up and down the hallway. Empty. Feeling a little uneasy, he tried to brush it off. He closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. Maybe it had been the wind, or maybe he'd imagined it in his half-asleep state. But no sooner had he pulled the blanket over himself, the knock came again. Knock, knock. This time it was a bit louder. Annoyed now, he got up more quickly, yanked open the door, and again, no one. The hallway was empty, the building was silent. It wasn't a prank, there was nobody in sight. Feeling unsettled, he locked the door again, double-checking this time. The sense of unease was starting to creep into his chest. But he convinced himself that it was just nothing. His mind was playing tricks. Moving into a new place could do that, right? But when he lay back down, the knock came again. Knock, knock. Louder this time, almost demanding. His heart began to race. This wasn't in his head, this was real. He stared at the ceiling, trying to ignore the sound, but the knocking grew louder still, more insistent. It was as if someone or something was pounding on the door, trying to get in. It was no longer a knock. It sounded like fists slamming into the wood, so desperate. The door rattled on its hinges, as if it might break. He froze in bed, his breath shallow and quick. He could see it fogging up in the air in front of him. He didn't realize it at the time, but the temperature had plummeted. Fear gripped him. But he stayed under the covers, hoping, praying that it would stop. After what felt like hours, the banging finally ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. The next morning, bleary-eyed and still shaken, he decided to take a closer look at the front door. And something about it had seemed off the night before, and he couldn't shake that strange feeling. He ran his hand over the surface and noticed something odd. The paint looked newer, fresher than the rest of the apartment. It was as if it had been recently redone. Curious and slightly unnerved, he crouched down and examined the lower part of the door. That's when he saw faint, almost imperceptible scratch marks, barely visible, beneath the layers of new paint. After seeing that, he went straight to the real estate office, demanding to know if something had happened in that apartment, anything that could explain the restless night he'd experienced. At first, the agent seemed hesitant, but after some pressure, she finally admitted the truth. Years ago, there had been a fire in that very building. A young woman had lived in the apartment alone. She had been trapped inside when the fire broke out. Unable to escape, she pounded on the door screaming for help, but nobody heard her in time. She died right there, by the front door, through smoke inhalation. The student's blood ran cold. The knocking hadn't been coming from outside the door, it had been coming from inside. The scratches weren't random. There were deep, jagged grooves made by fingernails. The student's heart raced as he realized the truth. Someone had desperately clawed at the door, trying to escape or alert the attention of people outside. Back at his apartment, his fingers hovered over the scratches, and in his mind's eye he could picture it, the woman trapped by the fire, frantically trying to get out, her hands slamming into the door, nails breaking and splintering as she fought for her life. It wasn't just the knocking he had heard last night, it was her, still there, still pounding, still trying to get out. With trembling hands, the student stepped back from the door, his pulse racing. The knocks were the frantic pounding of someone who had once lived there, someone who had died, the last desperate attempts of a woman to escape, eternally echoing through the night. That night, back at his apartment, the student couldn't sleep. He sat in bed wide-eyed, listening to every creak and groan of the building, wondering if the knocking would start again. The thought of that woman, being trapped and alone, haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of her frantically beating on the door, hoping that someone would come to her rescue. The knocking never returned, but the memory of it stayed with him. Every time he passed by the front door, he could almost hear it. Knock, 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 knock. As if the walls themselves remembered her desperate pleas for help. Even though he stayed in that apartment for the rest of his lease, he said he never quite felt alone again. Sometimes late at night, he can still hear it. The faintest knock, knock. Echoing in his mind, as if the woman's spirit still hasn't found her way out. This is the experience of a woman named Saeki Inoue, a pseudonym, who shared her harrowing ordeal that began on a seemingly ordinary night, transforming her life in unsettling ways. About a year and a half ago, Inoue-san was returning home from work late at night, just as it was creeping up to midnight. The day had been long and exhausting, filled with back-to-back meetings that stretched into the evening, leaving her with no time to complete her usual tasks. As a result, she had to work overtime, staying much later than usual. Such late hours were not typical for her. She was mentally tired and physically exhausted as she was heading home. She took her usual route home, transferring between trains and finally getting off at her local station. The walk from her station to her apartment took about 10 minutes. Given the late hour, the streets were eerily empty. There was no one in sight. Despite having walked this route hundreds of times before, something about that night felt off, as if a shadow of unease was following her. The streetlights seemed dimmer, casting long, wavering shadows that played tricks on her tired eyes. The usual hum of the city was absent, replaced by a silence that amplified every sound, including the soft tap of her own footsteps on the pavement. About halfway home, as she neared a small park that she usually passed by, Inoue-san was approached by a man. He was slightly overweight, with a mix of grey in his hair, appearing to be in his 50s. He was wearing a red polo shirt and light-coloured chinos, paired with a black backpack. At first glance, he seemed ordinary enough, yet there was something off-putting about his presence she couldn't put her finger on. "Excuse me," the man said. She was surprised that he spoke to her. His voice cut through the silence and distracted her from her thoughts. "I heard there's a poster of someone called Inoue around here. Do you know where I might find it?" Inoue was startled, because Inoue was her name. But she was just an ordinary office worker. There was no reason for her poster to be put up anywhere. The thought crossed her mind that he might be referring to someone famous, as the surname Inoue is quite common. Think of the boxer. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease his question stirred in her mind. Why would someone be looking for a poster at this hour, in this residential area? The whole situation felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. Feeling increasingly suspicious and uncomfortable, Inoue-san decided it would be best not to engage. She simply replied, I don't know anything about that," quite abruptly, and began walking away, hoping to distance herself from the weird encounter. However, the man started walking alongside her, keeping her pace and continuing to talk as if oblivious to her clear discomfort. "You walk this way often, don't you?" he said casually. You're out later than you usually are. Is work keeping you busy? Are you planning on getting dinner at the convenience store down there?" He gestured with his head up ahead towards her local store. The more the man spoke, the more unsettling it became. Inoue-san had no recollection of meeting this man before, yet he seemed to know quite a lot about her daily routine. He knew too much, in fact. This kind of familiarity seemed completely one-sided. It was as if he had been watching her or something, knowing her habits, her schedule, details that only someone with a disturbing interest in her life would know. Trying to make sense of the situation, Inoue-san began to wonder if she might have met him before and simply forgotten. She wasn't great at remembering faces, after all. Perhaps he was a distant acquaintance or someone she had briefly said hello to in the neighborhood. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that if they had met, she would at least remember something. Plus, the weird questions he was asking were too intimate, too invasive for someone she might have been friendly with. For whatever reason, perhaps not to seem rude, Inoue-san gave him the benefit of the doubt and replied, "Excuse me, but have we met somewhere before?" hoping to clarify the situation and jog her memory. The man stammered, "Well, yes, yeah, we have. We've met before." His hesitation and the evasiveness of his response only confirmed Inoue-san's growing suspicion that he wasn't exactly being truthful. There was a noticeable shift in his demeanor, a nervous energy that seemed off, like he was hiding something. It was clear that he knew her, but also clear that she didn't know him. The man was either a stalker or someone with ill intentions, in her opinion. The implications of either scenario was terrifying. Realizing this, Inoue-san decided to turn on her heels and run, her high heels echoing loudly in the quiet, residential neighborhood. After running a few hundred meters, she crossed the street and glanced back. The man was no longer in sight, which brought a momentary sense of relief. But just as she slowed her pace, her phone rang, displaying an unknown number. Tentatively, she answered it, her voice shaky with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Where did you go?" A man's voice came through on the line, chilling her to the bone. "Tell me where you are. I want to come and meet you." Panic gripped Inoue-san. How did he have her phone number? The realization hit her like a cold wave, a violation of her privacy that was both terrifying and infuriating. "How do you know my number? Leave me alone or I'll call the police," she shouted into the phone, her voice tinged with desperation and anger. "Found you," the man said in a chilling tone before abruptly ending the call. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She stood there for a moment in silence, with the phone against her cheek, paralyzed, unable to move. Then suddenly she felt a presence behind her. Inoue-san turned around to find the man standing there, much closer than she could have anticipated, he grabbed her. His grip strong and unyielding, he began to strangle her, pushing her down onto her back. The assault was swift and brutal, catching her completely off guard. "Be quiet, or I'll kill you," he hissed, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and something more insidious. "It's your fault for not treating me properly." Unable to breathe, Inoue-san's vision began to blur, her mouth filled with a liquid, saliva or perhaps blood, making it hard to swallow. The pressure on her throat was relentless, cutting off her air supply, sending waves of panic throughout her body. She struggled, her hands clawing at his arms, but her strength was ebbing away, replaced by a cold, creeping darkness. In a desperate attempt to escape, she kicked him in the stomach 2 or 3 times, her legs flailing with what little strength she had left. The man stumbled, the blows forcing him to loosen his grip momentarily. This gave her the chance to break free. She bolted down the street, her vision swimming, and her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could barely see where she was going. With air finally filling her lungs again, she screamed for help, the sound raw and desperate, cutting through the night air. A young man passing by heard her cries and rushed over, immediately pulling his phone out of his pocket and dialing the police. The stranger's intervention was a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink of a terrifying fate. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived, but by then, the man who attacked her had disappeared into the night. Inoue-san quickly set her phone to block the man's number. The sense of relief was overshadowed by a gnawing fear that he might find another way to reach her. The next day, she went to her parents' home seeking the comfort and safety only a family could provide. She began making arrangements to move. She couldn't run the risk of him coming to her home. The police continued to investigate, but as of now, they've not been able to catch her stalker. The lack of closure left her in a state of perpetual vigilance, always looking over her shoulder, her sense of security shattered. The incident left Inoue-san deeply shaken. She found herself questioning the safety of her surroundings and the trustworthiness of strangers. Despite the passage of time, she remains vigilant, forever altered by the harrowing encounter. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face, every unexpected noise brings a wave of anxiety, a reminder of the night she narrowly escaped a potential deadly situation. The experiences left scars, invisible but deep, shaping her interactions and perceptions in ways that she could never imagine. Inoue-san's story is a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most familiar places and how quickly a seemingly ordinary day or night can descend into a nightmare. Note, some details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved. I first noticed when my girlfriend came over to help clean my apartment. Now, I'll admit, I'm not exactly the neatest person. My small, cramped apartment was practically a minefield of trash bags, random items, and all sorts of clutter. It wasn't like one of those crazy hoarder houses you see on TV or anything, but it was definitely chaotic. There were clear paths to walk. My chair and TV were free from mess. I did clean every now and then, but let's face it, when you're living alone, it's easy to let things slide. My girlfriend, she didn't like the state of my apartment, and she would often use it as an excuse not to come and see me. I would always have to go to hers. She would occasionally come over and help me out with the mess. She'd take one look at the place, shake her head, and then start tidying up. I'd feel a bit guilty, so I'd pitch in, even if I wasn't great at it. We'd usually get the place looking halfway decent by the time we were done. The day that this experience took place was no different. She showed me. She showed up and immediately started cleaning. I joined in, picking up books and random knickknacks, trying to put things where they belonged. We were working on opposite sides of the room. Then she suddenly stopped and called out to me. "Hey, come look at this." I walked over to where she was standing, and she was pointing at an outlet hidden behind a pile of old magazines and videotapes. Yeah, this happened a while ago. From one of the sockets, a long strand of hair was dangling down. Not just any hair. This was long, dark, human hair. "Whose hair is this?" she asked, her eyes narrowing on me. She knew all my friends were guys, and I've always kept my hair short. Her hair wasn't this long either. I was just as confused as she was, so naturally I began to feel hot under the collar. I didn't have an explanation. I could see she was starting to get suspicious, so I reached out and carefully pulled the hair from the outlet. As I tugged on it, I felt something weird. There was some resistance. Do you know what I mean? The strand of hair went taut, and then there was sort of a snap, like when you pull a hair straight out of someone's scalp. The long strand fell to the hardwood floor, landing on the freshly cleaned surface, and swaying slightly in the breeze. It stood out like a sore thumb. I just couldn't figure it out. Why is this happening? Curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to peer into the outlet. All I saw was darkness. Nothing unusual, just a black emptiness inside. I do feel as if there was some empty space beyond the 2-pin sockets in the wall that stared back at me. I tried not to think of it much after that. My girlfriend and I finished cleaning, and later that night, we went out for karaoke. We had a few drinks, sang some terrible songs, parted ways. As it was a Sunday night, and by the time I got home, I was too exhausted to do anything but collapse in bed. The next morning I was running late as usual. I jumped out of bed, threw on some clothes, and grabbed my bag. As I was rushing to leave, something caught my eye. The outlet. I froze. There it was again, a long strand of hair, just like the one from the day before, hanging limply from the same socket. A black strand of hair, obvious on the hardwood floor. I was a little more than freaked out. I had definitely pulled that hair out of the socket yesterday, so why was it back? I hurried over, yanked it out, feeling that same weird tension, and then ultimately, the unsettling snap. I kind of shuddered at that sensation, so I did something impulsive. I grabbed an old CD player, a boombox, that I hadn't used in ages, and I plugged it into the outlet. I figured if something was weird about that socket, then maybe covering it up would help me forget about it. I tossed the strand of hair out the window and watched as it caught the wind, and then I rushed out of the door. For the next few weeks, life returned to normal. I got busy with work, and before I knew it, the apartment was back to its usual state of clutter. I started stacking manga next to my bed, and the bin was overrunning with trash. Every now and then, I'd think about that outlet, but with something plugged into the output, I managed to push it to the back of my mind. Then, about a month later, something happened that still gives me the chills. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. Groggy and half asleep, I fumbled for the light switch and squinted around the room. The noise was coming from the boombox, which was weird because I hadn't touched it in weeks. The sound was this low, grinding noise, like the radio was trying to play something but couldn't quite manage it. I got up and walked over to it, noticed that the stacks of manga had been toppled over, scattered around the room. It didn't make any sense. There's no way The radio was loud enough to knock them over. This weird grinding noise was still ongoing. And it was seriously starting to creep me out. I reached for the power button, and that's when I noticed that the boombox was already shut off. I stared at it for a moment, my hand hovering over the switch. How could it be making noise if it was turned off? Was it broken? I grabbed at it with both hands, intending to move it, and that's when I felt it, again, that same horrible sensation. The cord was tangled in something, a thick mass of hair, tightly wrapped around it like vines. My heart started racing as I traced the hair back to the outlet. There, where it was spilling out of the socket. This wasn't just a strand this time, this was a full-on clump of long, dark, dirty-looking hair. And it was pouring out of the socket and wrapping around the boombox's cord. I yanked it away from the wall socket hard without thinking. Snap. The feeling of 1,000 hairs being ripped out from someplace vibrated through my hands. At that exact moment, a piercing scream echoed around the room. It was so loud and so full of pain that I nearly dropped the boombox. The hair unraveled from its cord, fell to the floor, and that's when I saw it. Blood. Thick, dark blood was oozing from the socket, pooling on the floor beneath it. I let out a scream, stumbling back, crashing into the bed. The last thing I remember was the room spinning as I hit the floor. When I came to, I rushed to my feet, cleaned up as best I could. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer after that. I needed to get out, and fast. I packed a bag, grabbing my essentials, and I left the apartment, barely looking back. But just as I was about to walk out of the door, something made me glance over my shoulder, towards the outlet, one last time. A single strand of hair was hanging from the socket again. But it wasn't just dangling lifelessly like before. It was moving, slowly, almost deliberately, swaying back and forth, like it was reaching for something. No, not something, someone. It moved with an unnatural fluid grace, like it was alive. "Don't leave me. Stay." The voice was coming from the outlet, from inside the outlet. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted out of the door, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building, my chest burning and my legs trembling from exhaustion. I kept going, not daring to look back, not daring to slow down, until I was far, far away. I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't. I found a new place and threw away anything that had come from that room. I tried to forget what happened, but the memory has always haunted me. Sometimes late at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I could hear that voice again, whispering from the darkness, begging me to come back. The sound of static would fill my ears, and I swear I could feel something brushing against my skin. Soft, like hair. But the worst part, every now and then I'd find a long strand of hair on my pillow, or caught in my clothes, even though I've kept my hair short ever since that night. It's stupid, but I think whatever was in that outlet is waiting for me. It's patient, and it's hungry. One day, it might find a way to reach me again. My girlfriend thought I was crazy, and she didn't stay around too long after that. As for me, I like things to be clean these days. Clean and pure. This is my first time sharing a scary experience, but something happened last week, and I can't shake it off, so I thought I'd write about it. Last week I decided to go do some karaoke by myself. There's this place near my apartment, which the first and second floors of a building are dedicated to karaoke rooms, so it's super convenient. I went there at about 4 p.m, hoping to get a room with the DAM system. Hi, Jay here. When you go to karaoke, you can pick between systems such as Joy Sound and DAM. DAM is the best for Western songs, in my opinion. Each system has a different variety of songs though. Back to the story. When I asked the young girl at the counter for a DAM room, she went quiet for a moment. I assumed the rooms were full because of the time of day, but instead of saying anything, she just disappeared into the back. I could overhear her talking to what sounded like her manager, and after a brief discussion, she came back and led me to a room. Nothing seemed too weird until she said something that stood out. "If you need anything, please come to the front desk." Now, I've been karaoke plenty of times, and I've never heard a staff member say something like that before. Usually you just pick up the phone that's in the room or use the touchpad to order drinks or food. I didn't really understand it at the time, but wow, now I do. She led me to room 28, which was all the way at the back on the second floor. As soon as I walked in, I felt something was off. The room was way too spacious for a solo karaoke setup, and it had a massive window on one side. Now, most karaoke rooms I've been to don't even have windows, so I thought, hey, maybe this is a special room, and I was feeling pretty lucky. I grabbed the mic, and I started singing. Everything was normal till around 5 p.m. That's when things started to get weird. Out of nowhere, the remote, that was working fine the whole time, stopped responding. No matter what buttons I pressed, I wouldn't send the song requests to the system. Normally, if there's something blocking the signal between the remote and the machine, it won't work. But as far as I could tell, there was nothing in the way. It was just not working. Frustrated, I decided to manually input the songs by walking up to the machine itself. I kept singing, trying to brush off the weird vibes. The room had a great view, actually. I could see this wide open countryside outside the window. Just fields and mountains with the sunset painting everything in a beautiful orange glow. It was so peaceful. And for a moment, I forgot about the remote, and I just admired the view while humming along to my song. But then, while I was singing, I forgot the lyrics to the song. You know how sometimes you just kind of blank out. So I turned to look at the screen where the lyrics are displayed, and that's when I saw her. There was a woman standing directly in front of the TV screen, with her back facing me. She wasn't there when I last checked. It was so sudden and so out of place that I froze on the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't even process what I was looking at. In moments like that, you just don't know what to do. My brain was screaming at me not to let her turn around, not to make eye contact. So I just stood there, paralyzed. The thing is, the exit was right next to the TV. That meant that if I wanted to leave, and I really did want to leave, I had to pass her. But she was standing right in the way, and I didn't dare get any closer. Time passed, I'm not sure how long. The song ended, and the room fell into a dead silence. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat dripping down my back. That's when the phone in the room rang, signaling that I had 10 minutes left in my session. The ringing startled me, but it was enough to snap me out of my frozen state. In a blind panic, I ran towards the door, making sure not to look at her, and I bolted out of the room. As soon as I was safely down the hall, I glanced back, quickly, expecting to see her face, because I was in a position where I could see her profile, side on. But all I saw was the back of her head. She was still facing away from me. It was disturbing, to say the least. When I got to the front desk, the staff seemed like they already knew. They apologized profusely and did not charge me for the session. The girl at the counter I spoke to before even said in a hushed voice, possibly so that her manager couldn't hear, "We don't use that room anymore unless it's really busy. Sorry, please come again sometime." Needless to say, I'm never going back there. Oh, and one more creepy detail. On the way home, I realized that besides the fields and the mountains outside that window, there was a massive cemetery just off to the side. I was seriously freaked out, and I guess I'm kind of glad that this happened during the day, because I don't think I could have handled that at night. So here's a story that my dad told me about something really strange he experienced. He might have seen a ghost, or at least that's what he believes. When I was little, our extended family decided to go on a road trip together. About 15 of us in total. We rented a bus and we hit the road. It was one of those big family outings that are chaotic but fun. I don't remember much since I was a kid, but this story has been told many times at so many family gatherings that it's like a legend now. We reached our destination, which was this big, beautiful lake surrounded by the mountains. The plan was to set up the tents near the lake and have a massive barbecue. The weather was perfect at first. Everyone was in high spirits. The adults were grilling, the kids were playing by the water. It was a great time. But then out of nowhere, the sky turned dark. Thick clouds rolled in, and before we knew it, it started pouring. Like, really pouring. It was one of those sudden storms where the rain was so heavy you could barely see a few feet ahead. Our tents didn't stand a chance. Water started seeping in, and it was clear we weren't going to be sleeping in them that night, so we all piled back into the bus to stay dry. The adults weren't ready to call it a night though. They set up an impromptu party at the front of the bus, cracking open beers and passing around snacks. As the night went on, most people started to drift off to sleep in their seats. Eventually, only my dad and my uncle were left awake, still chatting, having a few drinks. It was well past midnight when they heard this faint tapping sound coming from outside the bus. At first they thought it was just the rain or maybe something like a branch hitting the side of the bus, but the tapping was consistent. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone was knocking. Curious and a bit unnerved, my dad got up and peeked through the window. What he saw gave him the chills. Standing outside in the torrential rain was a young woman, wearing a raincoat. She didn't have an umbrella, and she was completely soaked. Her hair was dripping wet, and she was just standing there, staring at the bus. My dad and my uncle exchanged glances. "What the hell is this woman doing here at this hour?" my uncle whispered. They were deep in the mountains, miles away from main roads. There were no houses nearby, no other campers. Nothing. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a mix of concern and unease, my dad cracked open the window a little and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman just looked up at him with a blank expression. "I can't come inside. So, please can you come out here?" My uncle frowned. "It's pouring rain. Why don't you just come inside? We can give you a towel or something warm to drink maybe." She shook her head slowly. "I can't come inside. Please come out." Something about her tone and her insistence was unsettling. She didn't seem cold or bothered by the rain at all. My dad felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Look, if you need an umbrella or a towel, we'll give it to you. But we're not going out there in this weather." The woman just stared at them for a moment longer, then turned around and walked away into the darkness. My dad and my uncle sat back down, both a bit shaken, returning to their drinks. "That was weird," my uncle said. "Why was she so adamant about us going outside?" Then it dawned on him. They were miles away from any civilization, in the middle of the nowhere during a storm, and a soaking wet woman shows up and asks them to come outside? Just didn't make any sense. Do you think... I know this is going to sound weird, but she was something not quite human? My dad said. Neither of them wanted to say it out loud, but the possibility hung heavy in the air. They decided not to dwell on it and tried to get some sleep, though neither slept well that night. The next morning they told everyone about what had happened. Of course the rest of the family laughed it off, teasing them about drinking too much and imagining things, but my dad and my uncle knew what they saw. A few weeks later they heard a local legend from someone familiar with the area. According to the story, a young woman who had once eloped with her lover, but for some tragic reason, some say she was jilted or something, she ended up throwing herself into the lake. Since then, people have reported seeing a woman in a raincoat near the lake during the storms, asking people to come outside. The description matched the woman my dad and my uncle had seen. Over the years, this incident became a staple story at our family gatherings. Each time it's told, it gets a bit more embellished, but my dad and my uncle always insist on the core details. They say that the woman looked entirely real, nothing ghostly about her appearance. She had feet, she cast a shadow, her voice sounded normal. That's what made it feel even creepier. But maybe people who die with unresolved feelings don't even realize they're gone. My dad mused once. Maybe they just wander around, blending into our world, trying to interact with the living. As a kid, hearing him say that sent shivers down my spine. I often wonder what would have happened if they decided to go outside that night. I know people talk about paranormal experiences in the mountain, and maybe there's some truth to it. But honestly, the idea of encountering someone or something like that really freaks me out. Whether it was a ghost or a person with bad intentions, it's equally terrifying. Either way, that story still gives me the creeps. This happened when I was back in middle school. My family used to live in an old, huge house in Kyoto. It was a pretty imposing place that had a sense of history in every creak of the floorboards. Apparently the house had been in my family for generations, and we were considered pretty important back in the day. My great-grandfather had the house rebuilt during the Meiji era, turning it into a 2-story Western-style home, which was quite rare in Japan at the time. It was the kind of place that you could almost feel the past lingering. Everyone in my family had bedrooms on the second floor, so at night the whole family would be sleeping upstairs, leaving the first floor quiet and empty. We were all early to bed, early to rise kind of people, and the house had a rhythm that we rarely broke. But one night, I don't know why, but I just couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with random thoughts. The old house was always so quiet at night, but for some reason, I was restless. I remember glancing at my clock, 3 a.m. I hate that time of night, because you just know everyone around is asleep. It's heavy with silence, and at the age I was, even the slightest sound could make your heart race. And then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside of my room. The sound was soft at first, like someone trying not to wake anyone, but it grew louder. As it got closer, the footsteps stopped right in front of my door. I froze, waiting for a knock or for the door to creak open. But nothing happened. The house was silent again. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just one of my family members getting up in the middle of the night. But then, something weird hit me. I didn't recognize those footsteps. You know how you can usually tell who's walking around just by the sound of their steps? My dad's steps were heavy and deliberate, my mum's lighter, almost hurried, and my brother's was somewhere in between. And my sisters were very light. But these footsteps didn't sound like anyone I knew. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt, and the longer I lay there, the more freaked out I got. Eventually, I did what any scared kid would do. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping to block out the fear, until I finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I told my older brother, who often stayed up late, about what happened. He gave me a relieved look and said, "You heard them too. But listen, whatever you do, never open the door." His reaction threw me off. My brother was the kind of guy who didn't get easily rattled, so seeing him like that made me feel even more anxious. I pressed him for more details, but he just shook his head. "Don't tell anyone about this, okay? And don't ever open that door, no matter what." I tried to get him to explain more, but he wouldn't say anything else. It was like he had decided that was all I needed to know, and that was the end of the conversation. I didn't push it, but his words stuck with me. From then on, I was on edge, especially at night, but strangely enough, I never heard those footsteps again. That's when things took a turn for the worse. The very next day, my brother was in a car accident. It was sudden, tragic, and he didn't survive. My family was devastated. I was in shock, barely able to process what had happened. After my brother's death, I didn't mention the footsteps to anyone. My dad, especially, had always hated anything to do with the supernatural. He was a very practical man, and talking about ghosts or spirits would have just upset him, so I kept it to myself. But last year, my dad passed away too. The story came up again in the most unexpected way. During the wake, my younger sister suddenly brought it up. We were sitting together, quietly sharing memories, when she leaned in and asked if I remember hearing footsteps outside my door. I hadn't noticed at the time, but apparently she had been hearing the footsteps for a while, way before I did. She confessed that on the same night I heard them, she also heard what sounded like my brother opening his door. The thought sent a chill down my spine. My sister admitted that she had been terrified and never spoke to him about it. She would hide under the covers when she heard the footsteps, waiting for them to pass. But that night she was certain that our brother opened his door when the footsteps stopped outside my room. What happened after that, we'll never know. My sister never talked about it again, and the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. What had my brother seen that night? Was he told something by my dad about the footsteps? Maybe it's something that gets passed down through generations. Why was he so insistent that I never open the door? And who or what was walking in our hallway at 3 a.m.? After my sister told me what she told me, I found myself wondering about my grandparents. They had both passed away long before I was born. But I heard stories about how they never left their rooms after midnight. My mum told me once, when she first married into the family, she found it odd. When she asked my dad about it, he just shrugged it off and said, "We're early sleepers." Seems strange to me that my family's wealth and this weird late night visitor thing, could those be linked? But now I wonder if there was anything more than that. What was it about the dead of night in that house that kept my grandparents in their rooms? And why did my brother have to remind me not to open the door? I honestly feel like I'm missing part of a secret, a family secret. These are questions that I'll probably never get answers to, and the memories are just that, memories. But every now and then, I find myself thinking back to that night. I still don't know what to make of it, and maybe I never will. All I know is that sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I still think about the footsteps, wondering who or what they belong to. This happened 2 years ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was August, just before the summer break ended. I was 17, nearing my final year of high school, and I was focused on getting into a top university. My days were filled with intense study sessions at a prep school 15 minutes from home, where I'd stay until 9 each night, pushing myself to the limit. My hometown was rural and quiet, with few people on the streets at night and barely any cars passing by. Each night on my walk home, I'd leave the main road, taking a narrow, winding path through farmland. Crickets chirped and frogs croaked in the fields on either side of the road, and I liked hearing them on the way home, in all honesty. It cleared my mind and provided some solace from the stress of school and exams. But on this particular night, something felt a little different. There was no hum of insects, no sound at all, really. The air hung silent and still, Overhead, the sky was clearer than usual. The stars were out in full effect. I shrugged it off, clutching my bag tighter as I took my usual path home. The road stretched out into Crossroads, a familiar place where the path branched off. To the left, a narrow dirt trail leading down to some old rice paddies. If I went straight, I'd end up at the back gate of a nearby elementary school, which was always locked at night. A right turn, however, would bring me home. During the day, people used this road frequently, but at night it was deserted. It always seemed to me to be pretty lonely. I quickened my pace, eager to get home to the warm lights and dinner waiting for me. But as I neared the crossroads, I noticed something up ahead. A figure was moving through the darkness, coming towards me from the direction of the locked school gate. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. There were no streetlights, so I could only see a faint outline in the dark. A human form, but I couldn't make out much else. Who would be out here so late? The gate at school was always locked, and I never ever ran into anyone at this time of night before. So it was so weird to me. As I walked faster, hoping to pass the intersection before whoever it was got too close, the figure grew clearer. My heart pounded. I was feeling really uneasy. I wasn't used to any form of confrontation at that age. I had a really bad feeling about what was ahead of me. 10 meters now, maybe less. The figure was tall, moving strangely in the dark. I guessed it was a man, and as I watched, I realized with horror, he wasn't just walking. He was skipping. Right, left, the man skipped toward me. Each light, playful hop bringing him closer in an uncomfortable, rhythmic motion, his body jerking up and down. Something in my mind screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted in place, as if fear had sunk its claws into my legs, pinning me there. He drew closer, and I could see his face. It was twisted into a almost childlike grin. His eyes locked onto mine. And then I snapped out of it. Fight or flight, you know. I could finally move, and I sprinted for the right turn that led towards home. The echo of my footsteps reverberated in the still night air as I ran, but as I reached the crossroads, I heard him behind me, a high-pitched, animalistic shriek that sliced through the quiet, sending a chill right down my spine. Now he screamed like a trapped animal, and the scream rang out sharp and almost gleeful at points, like the sound of metal scraping on metal. I dared a glance back, and I saw him running now, his body hunched, his fingers clawing at the air, as he ran towards me with a look of wild, frenzied delight on his face. My legs pumped harder than ever. The weight of the heavy bag on my shoulder was forgotten in my desperation to escape. I didn't care if I looked rude or strange. All I knew was that if I slowed down even a little, he would reach me, and I didn't know what he wanted from me, and I couldn't let him get close enough to find out. "Stop! Stop!" he shrieked, his voice trailing behind me. I remember the exact place I heard him scream like that. It's burned into my memories, that and the way the trees seemed to blur as I ran past them. The weight of his footsteps followed, closer and closer. I could almost feel the cold touch of his outstretched fingers just missing my shoulder. "Why? Why?" I screamed into the night, my voice breaking in a mixture of fear and confusion. No answer, just his relentless shrieking and giggling, the sickening sound of someone who took pleasure in this twisted chase. It was like he was a little kid playing tag at school or something. I tore down the path, sprinting the last stretch to my house, where the faint glow of the porch light beckoned like a sanctuary. I nearly stumbled up the steps, and then, with a trembling hand, I reached for the door handle. As I crossed the threshold, I turned back, praying he'd given up the chase. There was nothing. The road behind me was empty. The only sound, the distant croak of frogs, which had resumed their nightly chorus, as if nothing had happened. The man was gone. I collapsed inside, breathless, my entire body trembling with relief and terror. My parents were already home, and as I stammered out the story, they exchanged worried glances. The next morning, my mum and I went to the police, explaining what happened. They promised to increase patrols in the area and keep an eye out for the stranger. Apparently, there had been recent reports of a man disturbing residents at dawn, someone who had been in altercations with a few locals. My parents hoped he was just a lost wanderer, someone maybe passing through who would be gone soon. And in the end, they were proven to be right. I never saw that strange man again. In time, life moved on. I left home, started university, and I tried to put that night behind me. But even now, years and years later, the memory still lingers. Every time I walk home in the dark, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure skipping out of the shadows. The grin, the skipping, the jagged laughter. I don't know where he went or why he chose me that night. But every so often when I pass a dark road or approach a lonely intersection, I swear I hear it. A faint echo, just at the edge of hearing, if that makes sense. Right, left, almost like the sound of someone skipping. I work a job that requires me to stay on the move, checking in with my team over the radio, as we handle various assignments. Normally the radio is just a tool, a way to stay connected, but recently it became a source of something far stranger than I'd ever expected. Just a few days ago, I was using the radio like I always do, exchanging updates and casual chatter with my coworkers. Out of nowhere, my radio began to act up. It was only mine. None of the others had any issues. At first I heard bursts of static, harsh and loud, and crackling interruptions that came and went. It was so frustrating that I switched channels, thinking that would solve it, but the noises just kept coming. There was this relentless hum, almost like there was some interference that wouldn't clear. I tried adjusting the volume and moving slightly to get a better connection, but the interference remained. There was nothing I could do but endure it. And I remember thinking, why my radio? I couldn't leave my post, so I just gritted my teeth and waited it out, hoping that it would stop. I was getting pretty annoyed about it, until suddenly the interference cut out completely. For a second, there was total silence, like the air itself paused. Then, breaking that quiet, came something that caught me completely off guard. The unmistakable sound of a child screaming. It was a desperate cry, a voice so raw with panic that it sent chills down my spine. The voice was calling out, "Mum, Mum, it's hot, I can't breathe, there's a fire, please." The words were clear, each one of them carrying an overwhelming sense of fear and urgency. I stood there frozen as this child's voice boomed through my radio. It was so vivid that I half expected to turn around and see someone in distress nearby. At first I thought it had to be someone's television, or maybe a dramatic scene from a movie. But even that thought didn't sit well. It was the middle of the day. How likely was it that someone would be blasting a show with cries like that for everyone to hear in the neighborhood? Still, I tried to rationalize, thinking, well, maybe hoping is a better word, that it was just a nearby TV. But the cries went on and on. I kept listening, but very aware that I was unable to help. The voice just kept piercing through the silence. My stomach knotted. The cries had a desperate quality to them that I couldn't shake off. I turned the volume down to test if it was really coming from my radio, but when I turned it back up, the cries persisted, clear as ever. It was coming from my radio. I began to wonder if it could be a prank, But that didn't make much sense either. Who would go to these lengths to interfere with a radio on a random weekday afternoon, and why? Plus, kids messing around with radios in this day and age? It's a pretty outdated idea if you ask me. Growing more uneasy, I reached out to a coworker stationed nearby. "Hey," I asked, "are you hearing any strange noises like a child yelling?" They paused for a second and then replied, "No, nothing here." I let out a shaky breath. I was hoping I was just imagining things, but my coworker came over to check on me. As he approached, his expression changed. "Wait, now I hear it. Is that coming from your radio?" His eyes widened in disbelief as he listened to the same cries that I had been hearing. To make things even weirder, my coworker's radio was silent. No issues, no interference, just normal radio chatter. At that point, I'd had enough. It made no sense. We were all on the same channel at work, so why was the voice only coming through my radio? Frustrated, I switched off my radio, trying to block out those awful cries. But even though the radio was off, I could still faintly hear the sobs. They were softer, like they were fading. But they lingered for what felt like another 15 minutes. I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. It sounded like they were coming from nowhere, like the air itself. My skin prickled as each helpless sob grew weaker, until finally, they died out completely. The whole experience rattled me. That night I checked the news, looking for any reports of fires or accidents that might explain what I'd heard, but there was nothing. For a brief moment, I felt strange relief. Maybe it had all been my imagination, some bizarre trick of my mind. I started to worry about myself a little, but then I remembered that my coworker heard it too. I just couldn't figure it out. But exactly 1 week later, my sense of relief was shattered. I heard on the news that a fire had broken out in an apartment complex just near the area where I had first heard those cries. A young child had tragically lost their life in the blaze. My heart sank as I made the connection, and a shiver ran through me. That cry I heard. Was it a warning? A premonition? Since then, this disturbing phenomena hasn't stopped. 4 more times now I've heard voices break through on my radio, each one carrying the same frantic desperation. 3 times it's been cries for help after accidents. Another time it was the chilling screams of someone trapped in what sounded like another fire. But here's the most unsettling part. After that first instance, these voices seemed to be coming from not the future, but from past events that had already happened. I researched them. It was as if my radio was picking up ghostly echoes from the past. Every time it happens, it's only my radio. No one else picks up on these sounds, and I can't shake the fear that somehow my radio is a conduit for something beyond my understanding. I realize how crazy I must sound to you. So now I guess you understand why I've remained anonymous. At first I thought maybe I was just losing it, hearing things that weren't there. But every time someone else is around, they hear it too. Today was no different. My coworker and I were standing by when the radio crackled to life, and we both heard it. Clear as day. "Someone call the police, there's been a stabbing." That final cry left me on edge, unsettled in a way I can't even put in words. I don't know what's going on with the radio, but each new voice terrifies me. Part of me wants to stop using it altogether. But another part of me is morbidly fascinated, waiting to hear what's next, and fearing it all the same. This happened when I was a university student, living alone. I didn't really recognize how much money student life cost. I didn't really get any money from home. I needed some cash coming in, so I worked part-time at family restaurants and convenience stores, but then I found out that tutoring pays well, and it's a bit less demanding. So this is a story about when I used to work as a tutor and I ended up going to teach a lesson in a seriously messed up house. Okay, let's get into it. But here's the thing. Signing up with a tutoring agency seemed like a hassle with all the registration stuff and paperwork, so I thought screw it, and I just made some flyers myself. I got permission from the people around the neighborhood to put them up. It said something like, tutoring in English and Japanese for middle and high school students, 3,000 yen an hour. Contact me at ... A few days after putting them up, I got a call. The voice sounded like an older lady, maybe in her 40s or 50s. She said something like, I saw your flyer. Can you come over? Turns out she was looking for someone to teach her son. Here's where it gets wild. She wanted me to come every day for 4 hours a day. I was like, whoa, 12,000 yen a day? That's a jackpot. That's about $80 or 62 pounds. Looking back, I was an idiot. I really should have realized that something was off right away. Who has that much cash to spend on daily private lessons? And also, who needs tutoring for 4 hours every single day? Anyway, she wanted me to start the next day, so I agreed. The next evening, I ate dinner early and headed out, aiming to get there for about 5 p.m. When I arrived at the address, the house was old, tiny, lonely looking, just standing there on its own. The atmosphere was creepy as hell. It was already getting dark because it was autumn, so that didn't help. I crunched through the fallen leaves and approached the house. I told myself that it's just work, so just do it. So I pressed the doorbell, and even though I was feeling apprehensive, I waited for someone to come to the door. To my relief, the voice that answered was the same middle-aged lady that I spoke to on the phone. For a second, I felt a bit better. Then she opened the door, and my relief vanished. This lady was a mess. Her hair was full of dandruff, and she had these dark circles under her eyes. She gave me this really unsettling smile, and I instantly regretted coming. But I needed the money more than I wanted to run. Come on in, she said with a creepy grin. My voice was probably shaking when I said, thank you. I stepped inside. The house itself was giving off these eerie vibes. I asked where her son was, and she pointed to a room at the back. The atmosphere just kept getting worse the deeper I went into the house. We finally reached what looked like a kid's room. It had a dresser, TV, bed, stuffed animals, a toy robot, and a study desk. At the desk, I saw what looked like a kid sitting there. So I walked over saying, hello there. But when I got closer, I realized something was seriously wrong. It wasn't a kid. It was a doll, and a creepy one at that. It was about the size of a child, and it was dressed in clothes, but its face... oh man. It was just a piece of fabric, with 3 black dots for eyes and a mouth. I don't know if you have this frame of reference, but imagine one of those Shy Guys from the Mario games. That's what it looked like. Or the Kodamas from Princess Mononoke. This is my son, the lady said with that same disturbing grin. I felt all the blood drain from my face. This place was bad news, and I knew it. I blurted out, isn't this a doll? That was stupid. I should have kept my mouth shut. What did you say? This is my son. His name is Ken. She screamed at me. It was a total change in her demeanor. All the niceties were gone, and there was nothing but anger in her eyes in that instant. Her sudden outburst really scared me. I wasn't sure if I'd get to leave the house if I upset this woman, so I needed to calm the situation down to get out of there safely. Oh, okay. I get it, Ken. Let's study together now, okay? I said, trying to go along with it. It seemed to do the trick. She smiled again and calmed down. Of course, Ken didn't answer. I mean, he's a doll. So I started teaching. For the next 4 hours, I just sat there explaining things to this doll like it was a real student. Okay, Ken, this is how you use the verb to be, and so on. I just kept talking to the doll, pretending it was a normal lesson. The whole time the lady stood behind me, watching and smiling. It was beyond creepy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the 4 hours were over, and I said, "Okay, let's wrap it up for today, Ken." Of course, there was no response. He's still a doll. The lady, still grinning, said, "Thanks so much. Great work today." I couldn't wait to get the hell out of there, so I quickly packed up my stuff. The lady then said, "It's getting late. Why don't you stay for dinner?" I had already eaten before I came, so I politely refused, saying, "No thanks, I've already had my dinner." She insisted. "Eat something before you go," she yelled, and I didn't want to make her angry again. So, reluctantly, I agreed. I needed her to unlock the door. She had the key on her. She led me to the dining room and started preparing food, pulling out a dirty knife and some old pots. The whole time I was on edge, watching her every move, especially when she grabbed that knife. Finally, she served me some curry. It looked okay, and it smelled okay. I was just relieved it wasn't something worse. The plate was filthy, and the spoon was one of those plastic ones you get at a convenience store. Clearly reused. I took a bite, and it tasted just like regular curry. Not good, not bad. The lady watched me the entire time, grinning. "Does it taste good?" she asked. "Yeah, delicious," I replied, way more enthusiastically than I felt, because honestly I was terrified of her reaction if I said anything else. And then the lady said the worst thing ever. "Why don't you stay the night?" I quickly refused, saying it was okay, I'd head home, but she kept insisting. "Ken would be so happy if you stayed." No, it's really fine," I said, trying to stay polite. And that's when she snapped again. "You'll stay the night. You can't just leave Ken alone." I was trapped. Staying seemed like a terrible idea, but making her angry felt like a death sentence. So I said, "Okay, I'll stay." But in my head I was already planning to run as soon as I could find a chance. She laid out a futon in Ken's room for me to sleep on. Sleeping next to that creepy doll was the last thing I wanted to do. But I had no choice. Before she left, she gave me a warning. "The bathroom's next to the dining room, but don't go upstairs." That only made me more curious about what was up there. After she went to bed, I lay in the futon, waiting for her to fall asleep so I could sneak out. I had no phone with me, which sucked because I couldn't call for help. I waited for hours, and at some point, I must have fallen asleep myself. I woke up at around 1 a.m., and I figured she must be asleep by now. It was time to make my escape. I grabbed my stuff and started creeping towards the front door. I decided I would at least try to get out through that door, if not, a window on the ground floor. Just as I was about to reach the door, I heard a voice from behind me. "Where do you think you're going?" I froze. I turned around, and there she was, sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching me from the darkness with that smile. "You're not trying to leave, are you?" she asked, grinning. I froze. She was sitting there in the dark, watching me. She had been there the whole time, staring at me with that same creepy smile. I panicked. I bolted upstairs, despite her warning, flinging open a door at the top of the stairs, only to find myself in a room full of dolls. Shelves and shelves of dolls, all with the same blank faces and black dot eyes and mouths. And then I heard something. A terrifying shriek came from the back of the room. I turned and saw someone, with a massive head and bulging eyes. It gurgled like a drain. It wasn't a doll. It was alive. I freaked out. Without thinking, I jumped from the second-story window and ran. I didn't feel any pain at the time. The fear was too much. I ran like my life depended on it, not stopping until I reached the main road. I couldn't sleep that night. My legs started to hurt so much that I had to go to the hospital the next day, and I had seriously damaged my left leg. I never went back to that house, obviously, and I never took tutoring jobs from strangers again. I'm still not sure what I saw that night, and honestly, I don't want to know. I moved away from there, and I never went back again. I don't want to go there. I wonder what that was, the last thing I saw in that room. Hi, Jay here. There are a couple of comments in response to this post that are quite interesting that I'll share here. I think that guy upstairs was the real Ken. And since he was disabled, his mother was using the doll to escape reality. It must have been scary, but I'm pretty sure Ken was the one locked up on the second floor. Maybe those noises he was making was just him happy to see a human after a long time. This story was shared by a taxi driver who works the night shifts. It's one of those tales that just sticks with you. One you wouldn't want to hear if you're on a long drive in the middle of the night. It was around 2 a.m. and he was driving through Kobe when he saw a woman standing by the side of the road, waving for a taxi. Now you've got to understand, this wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect people to be standing around at that hour, especially not a lone woman. It was one of those eerie spots where you'd think no one in their right mind would be out here this late. But there she was, hand in the air, flagging him down. He felt a bit uneasy, but a fair's a fair, so he stopped and let her in. She got into the back seat, and he asked her where she wanted to go. That's when things started to get a bit strange. She asked him to take her deep into the mountains, a remote spot far off the beaten track. He started driving towards her destination as requested, but the whole time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the car cruised down the empty roads, his mind started to wander. This has got to be a ghost, he thought to himself. Who else but a ghost would ask to be driven into the mountains at this time of night? You see, ghosts hailing taxis in Japan isn't exactly an unheard of phenomena. He could practically see the end of this story playing out in his head. You know, the one where you kind of glance in the rearview mirror, then suddenly the back seat's empty. Or worse, there's water dripping from where she had been sitting. Hi, Jay here. Now, if you remember my last regional ghost stories video, about 3 or 4 videos back, I actually go over the story of the water dripping in the back seats of a taxi. It's a famous Kyoto urban legend. Anyway, back to the story. These are all the kind of tales that taxi drivers share with one another on those long distant trips and those rare moments they have their breaks to chat with one another. With those thoughts in his mind, he kept driving, feeling more and more on edge as the road turned into narrow, winding mountain passes. The deeper they went, the more isolated it became. The trees loomed closer, and the lights of the city faded into the distance. He couldn't help himself. He kept glancing in the rear view mirror, expecting her to disappear at any moment. Any second now, he thought, she's gonna be gone. He tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the car was building, and he was gripping the steering wheel tighter with every turn. But there she was, still sitting there. He could see her in the mirror, plain as day. She's still here, he thought, glancing again. Yeah, still here. Every time he checked, she was still in the back seat, still sitting quietly, staring ahead. No vanishing act, no sudden puddle of water soaking the seats, just her, watching the road. And the further they drove, the worse the roads became. Narrower, steeper, barely a track at this point. The sat-nav was hardly keeping up at this stage now. The signal was starting to cut out, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the fear was getting harder to shake off. What if she's not a ghost? He wondered. What if there's something else wrong? Eventually they reached a point in the road which was blocked. A no entry sign stood in front of him, marking the end of the line. He breathed a shaky sign of relief. Well, that's it, he thought. This is where she'll vanish. He turned around to look at the back seat and she was gone. The seat was completely empty. He reached back to touch it, expecting it to be wet. Expecting some trace of her to be left behind, some hairs, something. But no, the seat was as usual. She simply had vanished into thin air. Feeling a mixture of confusion and dread, he looked around. Where could she have gone? He thought, scanning the dark forest around him. Then, just ahead of his taxi, he saw something swaying gently in the wind. It was hanging from a tree branch, something pale and indistinct in the moonlight, moving back and forth. And then he heard it, a soft whisper next to his right ear, though he thought there was no one there. Thank you for finding me. His blood ran cold. The destination she'd asked him to take her to, the remote spot in the mountains, wasn't a house or a hidden cabin. It was the place where her body was hanging, her lifeless form. She had been dead all along. I live in a small city in Yamagata Prefecture, famous for its Yonezawa beef. And this story took place when I was in primary school, a long time ago. Although I didn't experience any actual ghostly phenomena, this was the scariest moment I've ever had in any haunted spot that I'd visited. Stick around if you have time. There's a local spot we all know of called the Haunted Mansion. I only recently learned that it was originally a block of flats where workers from a nearby industrial park used to live. Yonezawa is considered an industrial town, at least by Tohoku standards. I found that out recently too. I guess you could say I've done some digging into my past lately. It was during the summer holidays. Back in those days, airsoft guns were all the rage. At first we were content shooting at cans or plastic action figures, but after watching an American film called Class of 1999 with my mates, we became obsessed with what we called at the time, playing war. We couldn't resist, so we'd go out into the stifling heat on our bikes, shooting at each other by riverbanks or up in the mountains. Over time we wanted our games to feel more realistic. So we set some rules, we formed teams and planned our strategies. We even got hold of some goggles and some helmets for protection. Then one day one of my friends suggested that we play at the Haunted Mansion. I don't know if it went by any other name, so I'm just calling it what me and my friends called it. Now the Haunted Mansion was surrounded by rumors. No one really wanted to go near it, but it was the perfect spot for our war games. No houses nearby, no people to bother us, and lots of hiding places. We decided to do it at night to avoid the heat and any chance of getting caught. We gathered our usual crew, and most of the lads agreed to come. I packed a cheap bag of orange BB pellets, 2 airsoft guns, and a gas-powered Beretta 93R, and maybe one more gun. I can't quite remember now. I stuffed some snacks into my backpack too, and I headed out. That night, with my heart racing, I slipped out of the house through the lounge window, trying to be as silent as possible as not to wake my parents. I hopped onto my bike and headed out to our meeting spot. I arrived at the park where we all agreed to meet. 2 friends, A and B, were already there, hanging around near the toilets. 6 of us were supposed to show up, so we waited patiently. C arrived, but after about 20 minutes had passed, we figured D and E weren't going to make it, so the 4 of us set off for the Haunted Mansion. We rode up the dirt path in a silence of awe. Then, we hid our bikes in the bushes and crept onto the property, In the dead of night, it was beyond eerie, let me tell you. The entrance to the mansion was sealed off, but many of the windows were broken, so that meant that we could easily get inside through one of them. Before going in, we took a moment to discuss the rules for the game of war we were about to play, and we made a few backup plans just in case things went south and didn't go as we expected. I was paired with A, while B and C teamed up to form the other side. The mansion itself was massive, standing 6 stories tall, and its layout was similar to that of a school. Hi, Jay here. In Japan, for some reason they call blocks of apartments or flats mansions. Not like a haunted mansion that we might think of in Western culture. Just thought I'd chuck that out there. Back to the story. At the front, where you would expect to find the entrance, the doors were blocked off, but you could see the building stretched out symmetrically. On the other side of the building were 2 sets of staircases, one on the left and one on the right, which led to the upper floors. The mansion's design consisted of large open rooms or corridors between the staircases, making it easy to imagine how we'd navigate the different floors as we played. Each floor had spaces aligned like classrooms or rooms along the hallways. Something like that. It was the first time any of us had entered the building. I expected to get in through the ground floor window, but we climbed up to the balcony and slipped in through one of the shattered windows. The moment we entered, we were hit by a terrible smell. The place was in an absolute ruin, and it had this strange atmosphere to it, like it was something from a bygone era. Old bedding still lay on the floor, left untouched for years, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was as if the residents had vanished in the blink of an eye. The thing that scared me the most was finding a calendar from 1976. For some reason, that detail really stuck with me. We left the room, and we stepped into the hallway. It was pitch black, with no moonlight reaching inside. Our war game was quickly forgotten. Nobody really wanted to split up at that point. We tested the doors to see which rooms were unlocked. Most weren't, but a lot of the rooms didn't even have doors. It was like they had all been kicked in or kicked off. The walls were covered in graffiti, crude drawings and gang slogans scrawled across them, while the floors were littered with rubbish. Despite feeling a little more than apprehensive, we decided to explore one of the rooms. The entrance still had shoes lined up facing outwards, as if someone had only just stepped in and didn't come out. One of the flats we gained access to was small, but eerie. They had a kitchen at the front, leading to a 2 tatami room at the back. One of about 6 mats large, the other 4. Not a very big room is what I'm trying to say. The smaller room was bare, except for an old television and a table and a tiny fridge. The other room was relatively clean, but completely empty. We decided to rest for a bit, and we ended up chatting. Naturally, the conversation turned to the stories that surrounded the haunted mansion. Before it became a supposed haunted spot, the mansion had been employee housing for a nearby factory. Many families had lived there, but misfortune seemed to follow them. Legend goes that a child fell from the roof to their death, leading the parents to hang themselves in the woods through grief behind the building. Also, after the factory went bankrupt, there were 2 separate incidences of families committing suicide inside the mansion. Some said it was all connected to an ancient well that had been forcibly filled in before the mansion was built. In Yonezawa, there's a strange ritual performed when wells or ponds are buried and filled in to avoid bad luck. Maybe they hadn't done it properly. A suggested something reckless. Let's go check out the room on the 4th floor, where the family burned themselves to death. That was the story about the haunted mansion that creeped me out the most. There was a rumor about the room on the 4th floor where a family had died in a fire, committing suicide by setting themselves alight. We were all terrified, but we agreed. We had to know if the rumors were true. We had come this far, right? One of my friends thought of them as nothing but legends. But let me tell you, when he was actually there, with us, I could sense his fear. It was palpable. And I could tell he was terrified as we headed up there. We left the room. We began to climb the grimy stairs, moving slowly, step by step. First the second floor, then the third, and then finally the fourth floor. As we ascended, the wind was whistling through the broken windows. It sounded like a distant, agonizing moan. We shone our lights ahead and kept walking, hearts pounding in unison, no doubt. Then the four of us all stopped in the middle of the hallway. The room at the end of the hall didn't have a door. Most of the rooms we had passed were missing doors, but this one felt different, more sinister. We shone our torches into the doorway at once. The entire room was scorched black, burnt beyond recognition. We stood there frozen, paralyzed with fear. We wanted to run, and eventually we did, but at first, our bodies wouldn't move. It was as if the very air itself had us trapped, holding us in place. The rumor about the fourth floor was true.
My hobby is fishing, and I own an old car. Great introduction, right? I usually go fishing about 2 or 3 times a month, and I drive through countless mountain roads. My car doesn't have a radio or aircon. I usually listen to the radio on a smartphone through an app. Since my car is so old, it makes a ton of noise and I can never hear the radio clearly enough. I don't want to use headphones because that's dangerous. It's pretty lonely driving through the woods and the mountain roads in the dark, so I always put the radio app on for some BGM. Each radio personality has a different voice and a different rate of speed. I could always hear the baseball announcers clearer than the entertainment show guys due to the noise my car was kicking out. Well, it all started at about 2:30 a.m. I was driving through a mountain road and I heard a woman's voice distinctly and abruptly ask, "Can you hear me?" I thought that it could be like a section of the radio show, like, I don't know, like the listener's voice, "Can you hear me?" Something like a jingle, right? I didn't pay it much mind. But about 2 weeks later, I heard the same voice ask the same thing. I paid close attention this time. I checked the app, and the station I was listening to was the same as last time. And it was also around the same time in the morning, 2:30 a.m. On one fishing trip, I had a particularly big catch, so I was heading over to a friend's place to share the catch with him. We were talking about all sorts of things, and I happened to mention the whole "can you hear me" thing while we were drinking. He was convinced that the voice belonged to some sort of lost, wandering soul. By the way, my friend is an office worker who graduated from a Buddhist university. He's a very spiritual guy. He seemed interested in my experience. I ended up laughing the whole thing off since we were drunk, and I headed home. I thought that this would be the last I heard of it, but the next day, I got an email from my friend. "The next time you go fishing, and you drive past the place you heard that voice, play this," it said. He attached some audio to the email, and it was a recording of him preaching or some sort of message for this supposed wandering soul. I didn't listen to it much. I liked him better when he was less serious. The following weekend, I planned to do some fishing again. I passed along that road I had heard the voice, so I played his audio as he requested. I didn't care because, like I said, I could barely hear anything over the noise of my car as I was driving. But I noticed a lot of static. There was definitely some sort of radio interference. I didn't hear the woman's voice though. I felt like I had the answer I needed. It was just some sort of radio wave thing, and just a coincidence it happened in the same area at the same time of night. Over the coming weeks and months, each time I drove through that area, I was still curious and partially loyal to my ever-believing friend. I couldn't help myself. I kept playing his sermon-like recording whenever I drove down that road. And this is where things get weird.
You can hear me. You can.
I heard a woman say that over the recording of my friend's audio file. I was absolutely terrified and dumbstruck. It was the strangest thing I've ever experienced. It was like a baby monitor. The voice came and went in an instant. I remember I went home that night and listened to the recording over and over again just to make sure that it wasn't something like my friend's TV on in the background that could have caused that sound, or if he was messing with me and I hadn't noticed until that night. The recording contained nothing but his voice though, and it didn't glitch out once when I was playing it at home. I went and saw my friend the next day and told him about what I had heard, and he asked me to take him there as soon as I could. So the following Sunday, I picked him up, and the idiot was wearing a suit and holding some flowers. I chuckled to myself, but I didn't put him down. He seemed really serious. We went out to the area, and I pointed it out to him. He gets out of the car, where I heard the voice, and he placed some flowers by the side of the road. He asked me to join hands with him, and I did. It seemed to mean something more to him than it did to me. It was dark, and all I could hear was the sounds of nature all around me. The wind rustling through the leaves of the trees was relaxing. It seemed to make a sighing sound. He said, "You can go now," while he had his eyes tightly shut, and that was that. We decided to head home for a drink. I asked him about what he was trying to do. I don't know. I just wanted to feel something, but I didn't feel anything. I thought that I would just say something instead. I don't know. Ha. Okay. I was smiling. He's got a good heart. I just kept saying, "Don't follow us home," again and again, to be honest. I was grateful for that. I have driven along that road countless times since, and I haven't had any more experiences.
Last summer, I took a vacation with my girlfriend. We decided to go camping in Naskogen. It's a place out in the mountains of Japan. I heard about this area from a new guy at work. I ended up becoming good friends with that guy. We decided to go in a group. Camping is much more fun that way anyway. There were 3 men and 2 women in our group. Everyone but their partners worked at my company, so to be honest, we were a little lucky to get the time off at the same time. Everything went smoothly. I had just started dating my girlfriend, and I thought it was a great idea and a chance to introduce her to some of my friends. I was wrong. Oh, we had a great start to our trip. It was every bit as beautiful as my colleague and friend described. There was a safari park. It was amazing to see so many animals up close. We also went to the theme park, rode some roller coasters, and capped off the night with fireworks and a campfire-cooked curry. Pretty perfect, if you ask me. We played cards and drank until late, and I had no trouble falling asleep listening to the fire crackle away. I fell asleep in the clothes I wore that day. That night I dreamed. A dream where someone was calling my name and shaking me. Then the dream became reality. My phone was buzzing in my pocket. My phone is always set to silent, but with the vibrate function on, so thankfully it didn't wake everybody up. I reached for my phone and took a look at the caller display to see who was calling. It said that the call was coming from home. I really didn't understand why someone was calling me so late. Even though I was half asleep, my mind went to panic mode. I know that there is always a bad reason behind a call coming late at night. I worried for my parents. Just as I pressed the answer button, the call ended. I checked my notifications and I had 3 missed calls coming from home. I headed out of the tent, as not to wake my girlfriend, and I hit redial.
It was cold and the wind was howling out there that night. I wanted to get back in the tent, but I just couldn't leave it. However, no one picked up, no matter how many times I attempted to call back. Someone had been so desperate to get in touch with me, yet when I tried to call back, I got nothing but that hollow brr brr sound. Mum? Dad? Sis? What's going on? Are you all okay? These thoughts were swirling around my head. I was about to try my sister's cell phone, but then I noticed something that disturbed me. In my groggy, half-awake state, I failed to notice something. I had made a change in my contacts list. I had been living alone for a while, yet I never really considered my apartment as home, you know? So I kept my family home registered as home in my phone. It wasn't until recently, when I got sick of trying to memorize my apartment's house phone number, that I saved it in my phone as home, and I changed my parents' home number to Mum and Dad's. So with this realization, I stopped pacing back and forth, waiting for someone to pick up, and I stood still. I didn't have a second key to my apartment. 3 calls came from my apartment, an apartment which, as far as I knew, should be empty. I thought of my apartment, lights off, still at night. Could someone really be calling me from there? I decided to wake my girlfriend up and let her know what was going on. To be honest, I just needed to speak to someone. It was really confusing. I spoke to her about what I thought was going on. I guessed that there might be an intruder or something in my apartment. I decided that if they called back, then I would definitely answer the call, but I didn't get another call that night. I stared at the phone until it got bright out, but it didn't vibrate again. When we headed home in the morning, my girlfriend and I got into a huge fight. She had it in her mind that I had another girlfriend, and that was her calling while we were away. She also believed that because I only had the one key to my apartment, I must have given the fictional girlfriend my spare key. No matter what I said, she didn't believe me. I even offered her to be there when I opened my apartment door. I offered her to look over the place, but no matter what I suggested, she wasn't interested. There was no reasoning with her. Hell hath no fury. We broke up very quickly after the trip. What she thought that I had done turned out to be irreparable. What the hell was that phone call about? My theory of it being an intruder or a thief fell down when I realized, why the hell would a thief call my cell phone number? A number I guessed that they wouldn't likely have to hand. Plus, which burglar stops to make calls? Does someone I know have a copy of my key? Or is this just going to go down as an unsolved mystery? Either way, it freaked me out. I try not to think about it at night. I moved home after a month or so. I couldn't stand the idea that there could be someone with a duplicate key, and I didn't like thinking about something paranormal going on in my place either. Now, the reason I'm sharing this experience is because something about that trip came back to me the other day. A small thing that, if it wasn't for what happened, I likely wouldn't have remembered. My girlfriend and I had an argument on the way to the campsite. She said that I had called her and I didn't, so we had this kind of cute back and forth thing over who called who. In the end, I conceded defeat and I said something like, "Hey, if I called you, I just don't remember doing it. Maybe whoever called me that day called her." Both calls came from my apartment's phone. Nothing weird has happened in my new place, so I guess that whatever was happening, it's tied to my old place. I kept the number for my old place saved in my phone on the off chance that someone might call back, but so far no one has. I don't know what that was, but it doesn't feel like a person broke in to call me. I guess I'll never know.